Welcome to another roundtable discussion on the Old Testament. My name is Dana Pike. I'm a professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University. And joining me, colleagues from the ancient scripture department, Professor D. Kelly Ogden, Professor Thomas Wayment, and Professor Keith Wilson. Nice to be with you today.
Thanks.
In a previous session, we started talking about the first several chapters of 2 Kings, where we hear the conclusion of the prophetic mission of Elijah and how in chapter 2 of 2 Kings he was translated, taken away from the Israelites, and how Elisha became his prophetic successor, and have already discussed how the power and the word of Jehovah, the word of the Lord, were with Elisha. And so we're going to pick up today actually partway into chapter 4, 2 Kings chapter 4, beginning in verse 8. And this is a fascinating story. Would one of you be willing to help lead out in recounting this?
Story. This is one of the most beautiful accounts we have in the Old Testament. In fact, it deals with raising of dead, which is one of the rarest miracles in Old Testament times. Elisha is going through the Jezreel Valley. That's a great valley that cuts across the northern part of the country there, and to a little village called Shunam. It wouldn't hurt if we pause to mention that in our new set of maps in the Bible, map 10, it shows right in the middle of that valley. We're just a little southwest of the Sea of Galilee, a hill of Moreh. It's called. The little village of Shunam's actually not there, but just on the south side of the hill called Moreh is this little village. Not so significant, but especially because of what happens here. Elisha seems to be going through that valley a number of times.
Yes,
so this woman and her husband decide to prepare a place, a little room in the upper
Let's have the man of God
home.
stop and stay with us.
Yeah, I think it's
So,
significant that she actually says, I perceive that this is a man of God or a prophet.
Yes. So
what happens? They prepare a room.
Well, from that
He
point,
stays.
he does, and it seems to develop a relationship with the family.
Okay.
And in the process, realizing that she's childless and carries that burden with her. In fact, we see some of that in verses 15 and 16. And the prophet then promises her that they will conceive and have a child. And I like her statement because it shows her honesty of spirit. She says in verse 16, and she said, "Nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thine handmaid." Is this really going to happen?
an old woman.
Yeah.
Do you know what you're talking about
And
here?
I'm sure so many times she's been hopeful and had that let down, and now says, don't build me up if this isn't going to happen.
Right.
And then Elijah...
It's pretty specific prophecy about this season, verse 16, according to the time of life, 9 months, you will embrace a son. So that son was born, and then we just skip right to an older age when the child, verse 18,
was a young man,
was
probably.
grown, fell on a day, went out to his father, to the reapers, and he said to my father, my head. Something happened out in the fields. They took him, they laid him on the bed of the little room where the prophet Elisha often came,
Right.
and then he died.
Which is... one of the things that's always captured my attention in this story is she doesn't go out to her husband and wailing. She goes right for the prophet. She says, let me go find him. Will you give me a means of transportation? Will you send
She
me?
hears he's clear over to the west, clear across the valley, 10 or 15 miles to Mount Carmel, so she runs.
Yeah.
Verse 25, so she headed off. She took a servant with her, got on the donkey, and then headed off. And verse 27, when she came to the man of God, to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi, the name of Elisha's servant, came near, or at least associate, came near to thrust her away. Whenever I read that, I'm reminded in the gospel accounts of how people would come to Jesus, and sometimes the apostles would say, no, get away. But
Try to insulate him.
to kind of protect him and insulate him a little bit. But again, just as the Savior will do later, in the middle of verse 27, the man of God, Elisha, said, let her alone, her soul is vexed, and the Lord has hid this from me. It's an interesting little insight.
Yeah, it is.
He didn't have foreknowledge on this occasion of why the woman was coming, of what had happened, and now she has come, and poured out her soul and explained what happened. And he'd been involved in the prophetic promise that she was going to have this child. So I'm sure this was not only distressing to her, but obviously to her, but in part distressing to him as well.
I think it shows you the interesting just intersection between a prophet, a divine man of God, and his human side. And we sometimes overlook that because a prophet is a prophet, and it's such an unusual calling and such a powerful calling that the Lord extends. Notice he just says, he's hid it from me. He's not told me. It reminds me so much of President Hinckley when he decided to do the 60 Minutes interview. And in General Conference, to remember that afternoon session, I think it was 1998, a little while back, he said, now some of you know that there's going to be a show tonight where I'm interviewed. And he said, I don't know how that's going to turn out. I think he was kind of preparing us, and he was a little bit in the dark as to whether or not he'd done the right thing by granting that interview and going on national TV. And he said, if I made a mistake, I promise you one thing, I'll never do it again. But it's such a good reminder for us that prophets also exercise great faith and walk.
And they have feelings. The prophet is feeling her grief like Jesus when he was about to raise Lazarus, his friend, from the dead. Similar situation. He knew exactly what he was going to do shortly, but he still felt for their grief, and he was weeping along with them. A sign of greatness of anyone is if somebody hurts, you hurt too.
It says he was vexed. He saw that her soul was vexed. Caught his attention.
And because of his great concern for the situation, he tells his servant Gehazi, take my staff, you run ahead and touch the boy with the staff, that divine power would be manifest through an emblem of his prophetic authority. And in this case, didn't work.
No.
So he and the woman, the mother, then fall along behind.
It's so interesting what he then does. Verse 32, when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead, laid upon his bed. He went in therefore and shut the door upon them twain and prayed. First to pray. He had the Spirit in the room. He went up and lay upon the child, put his mouth upon his mouth. There's some kind of mouth-to-mouth artificial resuscitation involved with the priesthood power here. His eyes upon his eyes, his hands upon his hands. He stretched himself upon the child. Interesting.
The living image of the prophet superimposed upon the deceased.
And the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned. Notice, this is a little personal note. He walked in the house to and fro. He was walking back and forth, waiting for something to happen. And then he went up again and stretched himself upon him, the child. The child sneezed 7 times. One time, some years ago, I was touring 5 medical doctors from California through the Holy Land. And in this valley, rehearsing this very story. These are highly trained medical doctors, and we read that verse, and one of them stopped and said, oh, that's a Stokes-Adams attack. I thought, well, he recognized something about with the resuscitation going on there, and the child awaking and sneezing. He recognized, I don't know what that attack means still, but there's something powerful that happens now as the prophet presents that boy alive to his parents.
Yes. And so in verse 37, we read, at the conclusion of this episode, then she, the mother, went in, fell at his feet, bowed herself to the ground, and then took up her son and went out.
Notice also the parallels here. Another level is the parallel with Elijah once again. Elijah with the widow of Zarephath.
And the way Kings 17, right?
And the way he heals that little was his son, his little son, and it's very similar. There's this physical contact and things.
Another very interesting parallel is that exactly what Elisha did here, centuries later, Jesus will do on the other side of the very same hill. Shunam is on the south side of that hill. Just on the other side is a little village of Nain, where Jesus stops a funeral procession one day and raises him from the dead.
Right.
So, interesting parallels.
Yes.
Well, one of the themes that's going to carry this story into the next story is Gehazi, and I've always been interested in his involvement here because he's unsuccessful, and in a few moments, as we read about Naaman the Syrian, we're going to find that he's also unsuccessful. And so we might be developing the story in 2 ways: this very positive side of the prophet, but Gehazi slowly having difficulties, and we learn he asked something inappropriate.
There are positive lessons and some negative lessons.
Yes.
And what he does in chapter 5 then doesn't surprise us.
In a way, you wonder if it was almost rebuffed in that story, that he tried, he was told to try, and then failed. And so you wonder if there's some of that carrying through.
Maybe so.
Kind of
At the end of chapter 4, we have another one of these just short miracle accounts. Somebody's made some stew for supper, and some wild poisonous gourds have been cut up and popped into the stew, and Elisha heals the food so that those who are eating are able to eat without injury. Again, and we mentioned this in a previous session, so many of Elisha's miracles remind us of the Savior's, and they demonstrate that helping at every level. The power of God isn't just for dramatic healings if somebody is terminally ill or something like that, or for signs, but just to be a blessing in the lives of people. Well, that does bring us to chapter 5, and that's perhaps one of the best known stories as far as Elisha the prophet and miracles connected with him. And so we need to give a little accounting here. Let's set the stage. Kelly, do you want to get us into chapter 5, please?
There's a Syrian army officer living in Damascus, and there's a young girl from among the Israelites who's helping in the family.
She's been taken captive to Damascus and is working there.
As a slave. Probably.
And this high-ranking army official of the Syrians contracts leprosy and wants to be cured of it, of course. Is there any help in his country? No, but this little girl suggests that, hey, there's a prophet in my land, back in my land, just next door. You could go consult with him. So they send a letter to the king. Well, the king doesn't know about this. He thinks it's some subterfuge, political ploy. But then they finally connect up with the fact that there is a prophet in Israel. He has the power. Okay, let's take an entourage. Let's take all these gifts for this man. Maybe he can cure him of the leprosy.
Well, not necessarily be bought, but
to
thank him for what he's about to do, we hope. That's a more polite way of putting it.
Remember, leprosy was termed as the disease of the living dead. And so this was just to be dreaded, an incredible affliction at that time.
Well, and leprosy in those days was actually a variety of skin diseases and serious conditions. But typically, lepers were separated from the community. In Israel, for sure, as part of the law, but in other communities as well.
But one of the things I was saying about being bought here, about Naaman, was not necessarily that he's trying to buy the prophet, but he comes from a different culture, a different society, and why we would approach the prophet one way, he comes with gifts. Maybe this is what he'll require of me. What exactly will this entail? And
good point.
I like what happens then subsequently. He comes to the prophet Elisha, and Elisha says,
where are verse 10?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he gives him some directions which Naaman thinks are absurd. He says, that's just not right. And
go down and wash in the Jordan. Just go walk a few miles to the east.
Just take a bath.
Dip yourself. This is immerse yourself in the Jordan.
Symbol of completeness.
And he was irritated. He thought, hey,
Jordan's a small little river, little muddy river.
There are two rivers in Damascus that are bigger and better than this little muddy stream.
Yes,
why should I do that? But the point, of course, is, hey, if the prophet asks you to do anything, do you want to be healed or don't you?
Which isn't even Naaman's conclusion. It's his servant who says, if he had asked you something grand, you would have done it.
Verse 13.
Right.
Father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldst thou not have done it? How much rather then when he saith to thee, wash and be clean?
All right. We're 13 verses into this chapter, but we've seen the influence of servants twice. The servant girl, who's an Israelite in Damascus, saying, there's a man of God in my country, and he has the power to do something about this. And now Naaman, when he walks off in a huff because he doesn't think that the challenge given to him is big enough for his station and position, his servant says, maybe you should reconsider this. It just always reminds me of the influence that so many people can have on us if we're willing to listen to them, and the powerful influence that just an individual can have in helping someone else.
And it's not just the little things. I mean, it is the little things too. It's not just the big commandments. If the prophet asks us to do anything, we're talking today, we're willing to obey because we know there'll be blessings, even if they're little things, like the way we dress, the way we act, our conduct.
What we watch, what we do.
In fact, Elder Packer kind of caught that very thought in a conference talk when he said human nature hasn't changed over the years. Even today, some of us expect to be bidden to do some great things in order to receive the blessings of the Lord. When we receive ordinary counsel on ordinary things, there is disappointment, and like Naaman, we turn away.
Right.
Beautifully put.
Good application for us. Well, Naaman does decide to follow the instructions of the prophet, Elisha. And so in verse 14 we read that he did go down and dipped himself 7 times, or immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan River, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh came again. He's healed of his leprosy. He's made clean. He returns to Elisha and says, I'm really grateful. I brought all these things with me, some silver, some gold, some nice snazzy suits from the marketplace at Damascus. Let me show you my gratitude. And Elisha says, don't want any part of it. Right? Don't want any part of it. Thank you, but no thank you. And so he sends him on his way. And Gehazi, of course, has different plans.
A sad sequel.
And I was really happy at a recent general conference to hear somebody mention Gehazi, because so often we tell the story of Naaman, and it's a great story in and of itself, but that's not the end of the story. And we really need to work through the rest of the chapter here.
Unbeknownst to Elisha, Gehazi realizes the value of what's on those pack animals and decides he's going to go and take some of it. Why not, I guess?
Have you looked at the value, too? Boy, he brought a lot. 75 pounds per talent, and he had 10 talents of silver. He really packed out the bank.
He brought the bank.
So it gets to Gehazi. You can't.
All right. Well, Gehazi chases down Naaman and his entourage as they're headed back to Damascus, and says to him, verse 22, is everything okay? Yeah, everything's okay. My master, Elisha, has sent me saying, well, some of the young men of the sons of the prophets have come and he'd like something for them. Lying in the name of the prophet here.
Yeah.
And Naaman says, well, that's fine. I was happy to give something, so I'll give you a few things. And he takes them. Gehazi comes back, hides them in the house. In verse 25, went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said unto him, where have you been, Gehazi? A loose translation, but that's the gist of it, right? Where have you been? What have you been up to?
He lies again, too.
I didn't go anywhere.
Oh, I didn't go anywhere.
Lying to the face of the prophet. Verse 26, Elisha says, went not my heart with you when the man turned again from his chariot to meet you? Meaning what? This time, it hasn't been hid from him. He knows through the power of the Lord, through the power of the Spirit, what's happened. It's not a time to receive garments and olive yards and vineyards. It's not a time to receive riches, the things of the world.
Notice the ands. And to receive garment, and olive yards, and vineyards, and sheep, and this is apparently saying all that was in his heart.
Yeah,
what he wanted.
so.
The tragedy here is heart set so much on the things of the world.
Right.
And it's a heart
of overcoming testimony.
It's a heart that obviously has been kind of straddling the line. Because, he was given the assignment, well, you go and raise the little boy or something like that. He was watching as these miracles occurred. He's the servant. He's right there.
He's the personal secretary of the prophet. He's actually seen somebody raised from the dead.
And his struggle is that he feels spirituality, I believe, to a certain extent. He has to. He's committed his life to the prophet and things, and yet the material side also is a real tug on him.
Feeling like he wasn't quite getting
And you just
enough
hear that
that
Sermon on the Mount statement, you cannot serve 2 masters. And how often do we, kind of try to straddle the line? We want to be good church members, but the material things are awfully important.
There's a warning here, isn't there? He's faithful, but he has no intention of falling. But each one of us will be supremely tested.
Knowing that there's this lesson here, I put on my oldest suit coat this morning, but there is that tug in all things.
Another lesson, there are lots of lessons we could cite here. We don't have time, but let's at least mention 1 or 2 others. One that I love is this idea that you can't lie to the Lord. There are Latter-day Saints, unfortunately, that think, well, I can tell the bishop that or this, and if he doesn't pick up on it, well, that's okay. I'm going to get away with something. Yeah. But this reminds me that the Lord always knows what's in our heart. The Lord always knows what we've done. Yeah. We think we're fooling people if we're deceitful, but we're never fooling the Lord, and there will always be a consequence. In this case, Gehazi contracts leprosy as a consequence for his actions. But whether it's spiritual or physical, there is always a consequence to what we do.
I think he's almost Judas-like, and the author of the Gospel of John understands Judas's action as the same intent to get the money. He suggests that he had taken from the bag of the treasury. And in a way, we have here, too, a man who's close to the prophet, Judas close to Jesus, but yet both going astray because literally in Matthew, by their fruits you shall know them. Ultimately, the tree bears fruit, and they both turn up on the wrong side.
Yeah.
Luke 4, Jesus
Good point.
refers
Quotes the
back to both of these two great prophets, Elijah and Elisha. No prophets accepted in his own country. He says there were many widows in the days of Elijah. The heavens shut up for 3 years and 6 months. There was a great famine. But he was sent to a woman of Sarepta. Many lepers were in Israel. This is Luke 4:27. Many lepers in Israel in the times of Eliseus, it says here. Yeah, it's Elisha, the prophet, and none of them was cleansed save Naaman, the Syrian. The interesting lesson that he draws out of this, that he isn't being accepted by his own people any more than Elijah or Elisha were in their day.
Good point. There's a very interesting teaching in chapter 6, verse 16. The Syrians, and Syria is still today in the same place it was in antiquity. There's still a Damascus today, same one we read about in the Old Testament. The Syrians were fighting with the Israelites, and the king of Syria was feeling frustrated that everywhere he went, he felt like the Israelites were there to kind of counter his measures. And finally somebody says, there's this man of God among the Israelites, and he seems to know what's going on. And so they go and surround Dothan, the place where Elisha was staying on this particular occasion. They get up in the morning, and Elisha and his servants and the other people in the town are much concerned. And so in chapter 6, verse 15, towards the end of verse 15, the servant of Elisha says to him, "Alas, my master, what are we going to do?"
Can you just see him? He comes running in.
Yeah, we've got a big problem here, right? Yeah. We've got a big problem. So in verse 16, Elisha answered, "Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray thee, open this young man's eyes, that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. And they end up being A-OK as we continue in the story. Interesting, though, again, that imagery of divine glory and the presence, the power of the Lord is there to help them. And it must have been a great comfort to that young man to say, okay, I can trust the prophet, I trust the Lord, and everything will work out all right.
It's also a great Christ symbolism again. I mean, all the times that Jesus says, "I am come to give sight," I am come to open the eyes of the blind, and just give that perception.
Yeah, and there's so often a correlation between physically seeing and spiritually seeing and understanding through the power of the Spirit. Well, let's move over to chapter 8. In 2 Kings chapter 8, Elisha undertakes a mission, beginning chapter 8, verse 7, to go to Damascus and to meet with the king, Ben-Hadad of Syria. And we might say, why is that going on? It's interesting. We won't look it up now, but in 1 Kings 19, when Elijah was still on the earth and went to Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, and the famous incident where the Lord's not in the fire and the earthquake and the wind, but with a still small voice. The Lord assures Elijah that there are some faithful Israelites still. He's not the only one. And he gives him a commission that he's supposed to go appoint his successor Elisha. He's supposed to anoint a new king in Israel. And he's also supposed to go to Damascus and interact with the king there. And Elisha receives 2 of those commissions from Elijah, who did not accomplish them before he was taken away. And so this is one of them. And we hear that he goes to the king to see the king. He doesn't actually get in to see the king of Syria. He's ill. And the servant of the king, or an associate of the king named Hazael, comes out and says, well, the king wants to know if he's going to get better or not. And Elisha says, well, he could get better, but I see that he's going to die. And again, as we've mentioned, the personality, the feelings of the prophet Elisha here. Verse 11, he settled his countenance steadfastly until he was ashamed. And the man of God wept. And Hazael, this associate of the king, said, why are you crying? What's bothering you? And Elisha says, because I know the evil that you are going to do unto the children of Israel. Again, through the foreknowledge of God, Elisha sees how this man is going to come to power and is going to be involved in attacks on the Israelites. And that happens. This fellow Hazael kills the king in bed and then takes control of the country.
Well, yes. a parallel theme here is that God is not with Israel. And yet you see how Israel's prophet, Elisha here, is so affected to be able to prophesy and foretell how much evil is going to come upon Israel. It's such a dichotomy.
The protection of the Lord has been withdrawn from them.
He has such great feelings for the people that he's called to minister to, and yet he also has to see the path and declare the path that they're headed down is not going to end up.
Okay.
One other interesting point we can make through all the whole Old Testament is what about prophets being involved in politics? There are some people, even in the church, who think that, and they'll even put it in a rather stark way, that prophets ought to keep their noses out of politics.
They don't.
And I would say they haven't read the Old Testament then, because prophets, Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Isaiah, they're all very involved. Can we limit what the Lord will say, even in political matters and to do with nations?
Even in the New, John the Baptist questions of political marriage, of political union.
Yes.
Okay. Perhaps we can just make a quick summary of chapter 9, and that will be the last thing we have to say here. Elisha sends out one of the sons of the prophets on a mission to anoint Jehu, a general in the Israelite army, to become the next king and to help to terminate the dynasty that Ahab was a part of previously.
To cleanse Israel.
So this fellow Jehu is anointed in the standard pattern of kingship that we know about in the Old Testament, and he rides into town, into the capital. Then he goes to Jezreel, where Jezebel is, the widow of King Ahab. She's thrown out the window and dies. They come out of the saloon to see what's left of her, and the dogs have eaten her. So let's go to chapter 9, 36 and 37. We're going to have to conclude with this grisly story. They came out, and all that's left of her, essentially the skull and her hands and her feet. And Jehu says in verse 36, "This is the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the portion of Jezreel, the city, shall the dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel the queen." And so they took up what was left. But once again, we're reminded the word of the Lord does not fall to the ground in the idiom of the Old Testament. Everything is fulfilled. In those days, same in our day as well.
For more information on this program, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org.